Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Brenda J. Today we have Chuck Degroat on the podcast, author of When Narcissism Comes to Church. He is also a professor, therapist, and spiritual director that offers soul care intensives. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Karen.
Yes, good morning. So this is Karen. So I thanks so much for being on our podcast. We both loved your book, and we're going to quote a lot from your book because there's so much information to cover and got so much out of it. But in your book, you quote from the book, The Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Losch, and he defines narcissism as a longing to be freed from longing. In other words, the narcissist cannot tolerate the limitations of his humanity. You say what Losch seems to be saying is that narcissism is about control. It is a refusal to live within God-ordained limitations of creaturely existence. Narcissism makes us less human. Eventually, the masks meant to protect ourselves and ease the ache of our longings become the only faces we know. I thought this was interesting, that it's like a form of protection for them. And I cried when I was reading that. I mean, both from realizing I had some narcissism in me, but also just having compassion. I mean, I do have narcissists that were in my life, but I've always kind of had that compassion of knowing that there was a trauma behind it. So I thought it was really interesting. And there is just that sadness of that aspect of it, that there's a lot of healing that hasn't happened. I've struggled to understand narcissism. And in your opinion, do you think they have control over it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think, given what I know about sort of like the origins, what we call the etiology of narcissism, I don't think that this is like controlled as if there's like an on-off switch, or I can turn up my narcissism a bit or turn it down, in large part because I think what we know about narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder is that a personality disorder really emerges out of childhood wounds and trauma. And so it becomes a compensatory way of living in the world, a way of compensating and coping with a broken world. I've got to be strong because when I'm not strong and I'm weak, I'm vulnerable and I'm prone to being hurt. I'm going to be armored up and defensive and strong in the world so that I never get hurt again. And I think that that's kind of what Losch is getting at in that book. They long to be freed from longing. In other words, they see their limits as obstacles to being free, to being powerful, when in reality, God made us in and for and with limits, right? I love, in my tradition, we celebrate Ash Wednesday. And at Ash Wednesday, we say, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And there's something about that that's really, maybe it sounds morbid, but to me, it feels really freeing to know I'm not unlimited. I'm not superhuman. Yeah.
Yeah, that we all have vulnerability, and that's part of being human.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I like how you say, because each person is created in God's image, we cannot reduce people to a label or claim to fully understand them based on one predominant part of their personality. Human beings are fearfully and wonderfully made, Psalm 139:14. The biblical story defines human beings by their divinely dignified identity first and foremost, and thus sin is secondary, contingent, a disease of the soul. We must resist relegating anyone to a label, or narcissist or alcoholic, anxious or depressed. Ultimately, a descriptor like narcissist names the persona. The mask, a part of someone like other descriptors, doctor, father, diabetic, autistic. It does not account for our core true self, hidden with Christ in God. It's not their identity. So I like how you remind us not to be so quick to use that label. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think this is so important. And it's tricky for some people to hear that, because think about it for a moment. If you've been abused by a narcissist, that's all you know of that person to some degree, right? I mean, you felt the, right? I mean, that's the part of that person that hurt you so deeply. And I think it's tricky to say, well, okay, yeah, but he's an image bearer too. I don't see much of an image bearer in him, right? So I want to be really empathetic. Right? Like I'm prior to definitions, like I'm first and foremost, I'm a therapist. I sit with people who've been abused. And when you're in a situation like that, you don't really need or want a whole lot of nuance like that. But I do think it's important when we talk about this that to understand that underneath, I think we'll probably get into this a little bit more, but beneath every grandiose narcissist, every sort of powerful bully, there's an ashamed little boy, there's an ashamed little girl. There are parts of them that they don't want the world to see. And when I've done work with narcissistic men in particular, every once in a while, and this is very rare, but every once in a while, you can kind of get there. You can kind of get back behind the bullying, powerful self to that little boy or little girl. And I think it's also important to say that God sees us first as image bearers, not as narcissists, alcoholics, autistic. Those are ways of naming our sin, our pathology, our struggles, and things like that. But that's not core to who we are. And when I do this work, that can often be important, even in the healing journey of someone who's on the narcissistic spectrum. It can be humbling to see, oh yeah, that's not all of who I am. And maybe there is a possibility for me to grow up and to mature into something else and someone else. It's complicated, right? But I think it's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, no one wants a negative label attached to them as their identity.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, I saw that scared little, that other side that you're talking about in the narcissist that I had experience with. But I just thought that was like them being fake. So that's not necessarily true.
No, I mean, but it could be, I mean, yeah.
If they're a sociopath too, right?
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely, there's a fake. I mean, you see, I write a little bit about vulnerability, a fake vulnerability, a false vulnerability. So there are definitely narcissists who play vulnerable. I'm not as powerful as you think I am, and you hurt me. They play the victim, right? But I think what I'm thinking of is a genuinely young part of them that,
right.
That does hold the story of woundedness. My experience is they keep that guarded and compartmentalized and put away at all costs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you say, and I agree, that your belief is that God desires truth in our inner being, Psalm 51:6, and that this truth has the power to transform our lives, our churches, our relationships, and our society. Dismantling the narcissistic false self is an act of dying to illusion, to control, and to fear. And it's also an act of resurrection to truth, to vulnerability, to creativity, and to connection. As we trust that love desires the best for us and not our downfall, perhaps we'll all tire of the mask we wear and come out of hiding. I always think of that song by Casting Crowns called Stained Glass Masquerade. I love that song. It just talks about taking off your mask and, showing that realness.
Yeah.
May all of us be committed to the work to know the freedom that comes as we step out from shadows into the light. So do you want to share any real life hopeful situations? I know in your book you list some examples of.
Yeah. In other words, people who've maybe made that journey from their mask to more vulnerability or more authenticity, right? I mean, and that's, what we know about narcissistic personality disorder is that that's very rare. I talk about narcissism on a spectrum. And so there are folks who are narcissistic personality disorder, and then there are some who just have narcissistic features. But we know with narcissistic personality disorder, which needs to be diagnosed by a therapist or a psychologist, that it's really, really rare to see substantial change. It's very incremental. This is why it's so tough if you're married to someone with NPD. Change is like, okay, so I've got to be in this for 10 years to see any kind of substantial change. That's hard. But I think what you begin to see, if change really starts to happen, is you actually begin to see a little bit of the Clark Kent behind the Superman, if you know what I mean. You see some vulnerability. You maybe hear a bit of their story that you hadn't heard before, and you realize, oh, so you're not always in control. You feel weak. You feel out of control at times, or scared, and you begin to recognize it as authentic. Not, as we were talking about earlier, sometimes that can be fake, but you begin to recognize it as authentic. And there are just these small moments, even small confessions, like when for the first time he says, I'm sorry, and he's really specific about how he hurt you. That tends to be a bit more rare, because if you're a narcissistic, you're going to protect yourself at all costs, and your apologies are going to be very shallow. But maybe this is a specific apology. not only did I shout at you, but I shouted at the kids, and I realized that I tried to intimidate them and intimidate you. Okay, that's more specific. So that's, you begin to see little things like that. So for me, stories of hope are usually found in increments, not an overnight transformation.
Right. It's a process.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say that someone that doesn't apologize at all ever about anything, would they be considered a narcissist or not necessarily?
Well, I mean, there could be a number of different reasons that someone doesn't apologize at all for anything. And it could be a different personality disorder. It could be addiction of some kind, where I think when someone is severely addicted, it's rare that you ever get the truth, or at least the whole truth. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that they're narcissistic, but I think with all what we call personality disorders, these are ways that we learned very early on of coping and hiding in the world. And so the reality is that you're, in a sense, you're living a lie. And so there are going to be plenty of lies that manifest from that embodiment of a larger lie, right? That is the personality disorder. And the great lie is, for a narcissist, is I have to be grandiose to survive in the world. I have to be powerful because it's eat or be eaten. And so survive at all costs. And so what's true is you're not going to experience truth from a narcissist in a meaningful way, because there's always an angle. There's always some shade of truth that they might give you, but not the whole truth.
Oh, yeah, I totally experienced that. So you say we're also susceptible to narcissistic behavior. There are times when we all feel superior. We lay in bed at night thinking we deserve more. We compare and compete. These are general traits that might be shared with someone who is a narcissist. But narcissistic personality disorder is something far more serious, characterized by grandiosity, entitlement, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. That's the real separation. I think we just talked about this a little bit.
In your book, you say, the sad abandonment of the humble way of Jesus shows up today in pastors of large and small churches, in beloved Christian celebrities, prolific clergy authors and bloggers, dynamic church planters, and seemingly godly men and women. The frighteningly reality of narcissism is that it often presents in a compelling package. The entitlement and absence of empathy characteristic of narcissistic personality disorder was translated into the profile of a good leader. Those affected by narcissism's bite were led to believe it was their fault, a lack of humility, a failure to submit. It is what a lot of churches are looking for in a pastor, charisma, it seems, more than humility. Does this come from churches being run more like businesses, do you think?
I think that's definitely a part of business, CEO, entrepreneurial culture within churches. I think that that's part and parcel of an American way of doing life, right? Capitalism. And that's now kind of baked into the discipleship and formation of our churches. When I think about Jesus, I think of the suffering servant. For Jesus, it wasn't about building an organization, becoming a CEO.
Right, different focus.
Right. But I think that now that our churches are being formed more by, you might say, more by kind of an American ethic or capitalism, you see a lot more of that. And so it really does require us to think deeply about what it means for our churches and our pastors to be shaped by the life of Jesus rather than the life of, an economic theory or a sort of an American manifest destiny or something like that.
Right. Or some business plan.
Yeah. Or some business plan. I mean, and that's a big issue of, I was a pastor for a number of years in two churches, one in Orlando, one in San Francisco. And I led the discipleship and spiritual formation ministries of those churches. And it's like, boy, as a pastor, you feel like oftentimes when you're trying to grow people in the image of Jesus, you're going against a lot in culture that tries to grow them in different ways, right? And what we're talking about is just one of those ways, which is if you don't win, you lose. It's dog eat dog, eat or be eaten, win or go home. It's that kind of thing. And I think a lot of church planters are infected with that kind of disease of American capitalism. And so it requires a new kind of discipleship.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you do for a living. And when I was reading your book, just how you talked about you had to be honest with people when you saw those red flags after they took those tests. So I just appreciate what you do. I really, really do. And all the experience that you've had and all the years you've been doing this. So you explain that narcissism exists along a spectrum from healthy to toxic. On one end is healthy narcissism, where we live humbly yet confidently, anchored by an experience of being loved deeply at the core level. When we're loved well, we develop a healthy confidence. Where we see healthy narcissism, we also notice a healthy shame, a recognition of our limitations, and a humble acknowledgement that we are not the center of the world. Note how both work in tandem. Translated for Christians, this is an acknowledgement of both our beauty and brokenness, a recognition of God's delight in us alongside a recognition of our human weakness and fragility. Both are essential for a wholehearted life in Christ. The unhealthy narcissistic person becomes convinced that this is who he or she is. This false self and the cost of his loss of connection to this core true self manifests in a toxic style of relating. Sadly, when narcissism becomes toxic, the person generally has little to no capacity to see herself or see the debris of relational damage in her wake. Her ego, defensiveness, is the product of years of self-protection, and most clinicians would be skeptical about the prospect of substantial change. Seeing the contrast there is helpful, and again feels sad to me. Anything to add to all of that?
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that you just said is often kind of controversial for people. Healthy narcissism? What's that?
Yeah.
And that's not, I didn't come up with that, by the way. That's a term psychologists use. And when I think about healthy narcissism, well, what they mean by that is think about like your 3-year-old who learns to do a kind of basic cartwheel and says, "Mommy, mommy, mommy, look at me. I'm so good at cartwheels. I'm the best in the world." That's a kind of like healthy look at me. And I'm probably not at that point going to say that 3-year-old has narcissistic personality disorder, but
being a 3-year-old.
No. But if you're like 45 years old and you're looking at a church from a platform and you're like, church, I'm the
Look at
best
me.
pastor ever, that's a problem. That's a real problem. So I think here, one of the things that we know about narcissism is that if you were wounded, if you were hurt, if you were abused, if you didn't receive the kind of really healthy attention you needed as a young person, you're apt to find not so good ways of getting that attention, and people are sometimes surprised when I say this, but narcissists are very lonely because they're living with themselves. Basically, it's that old image, that old Greek myth of the person looking in the pool of water and seeing their reflection. I mean, it seems like they have a lot of friends, but they, by definition, a narcissist can't really be known. And so you talk to spouses and relationships with people who are narcissistic, and they're like, there's not really a relationship because he doesn't let anyone in.
Right.
And so it's desperately lonely. I think that when I talk about narcissistic personality disorder, I'm really thinking of someone who is covered over by layers and layers and layers of self-protection that leave him utterly alone.
Yeah, there really is a sadness to that. You say that at its most extreme, narcissism can manifest in violence, bullying, coercion, and lawlessness. All the while, a massive iceberg of shame is driving it. Few know that this is the inner drama of one who suffers from narcissism. Few can empathize with the desperate need to connect to something, anything, when narcissism's bite penetrates and wounds. And yet, only by tending to the inner wound can one truly heal from it. The little boy or girl within is wounded, and the well-crafted narcissistic false self provides a shield to protect the child. But the child longs to be known. It's just like what you're saying. Yeah. And I'm convinced, this is your words, based on my work with narcissists, that the protective false self is weary and longs to be done with a charade. So shame really is what lies behind a lot of that. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. If you can imagine, like someone has built a big sort of brick fortification, like a castle wall, and is throwing grenades over the wall at other people. That's what a narcissist does. It's like this big wall that's been built up to protect him. And if you're in the life of a narcissist, you're experiencing those explosions all around you. And it's sort of like, that's why when we were talking earlier about narcissism, the word like not defining a person wholly. Well, if you're experiencing those grenades and explosions all around you, all you see is explosions and a big wall. And so it feels like, well, that's all he is. He's a narcissist, and this hurts. I think part of what we've been talking about here is if there's any kind of healing journey for a narcissist, it's recognizing that behind that wall is that frightened little boy. And in my work, the only way we ever get there, and maybe this is more than what you're asking for, but we've talked a little bit about this little boy, so I'll say it. The only way we ever get there is if life comes crashing down, like a ministry, a marriage, kids. And even then, it takes a lot for them to once and for all get vulnerable. It's almost like you have to lose everything. I think Jesus said something about this, Mm-hmm. You almost have to lose everything to find yourself, because if these guys, and I use that intentionally because I see this mostly in men, if these guys still feel like they've got they've got an angle. They've got a way of preserving their reputation, a way of getting back into the pulpit or onto the stage. They'll find the way, and they won't become vulnerable. And so no matter what I do, no matter what work we do in counseling, it's just not going to happen. He's going to find his way back into grandiosity. And so a lot has to come crashing down.
Wow. You have to have a real wake-up call.
Mm-hmm.
So you quote 6 characteristics of leaders with narcissistic personality disorder. And you say in the helpful book, How to Treat a Staph Infection, Resolving Problems in Your Church or Ministry, Craig and Carolyn Williford identify 6 primary characteristics. 1, all decision-making centers on them. 2, impatience or a lack of ability to listen to others. 3, delegating without giving proper authority or with too many limits. 4, feelings of entitlement. 5, feeling threatened or intimidated by other talented staff. 6, needing to be the best and brightest in the room. You have identified 4 additional characteristics: inconsistency and impulsiveness, praising and withdrawing, intimidation of others, and then what you term factionability, which we kind of talked about a little bit. Your book goes into greater detail, but anything else you want to expound on in that?
Well, so yeah, I think the one that people are finding most interesting nowadays on that is this vulnerability. It's not vulnerability, but faux, F-A-U-X, right? So a false vulnerability.
Yeah, I think she pronounced that wrong.
We'll have to edit that to fix that word.
That's fine. It's kind of a weird word, right? But and I thought, by the way, true confessions here, I thought I coined that term. I thought I was so brilliant. Wow, I came up with the term, and I think it's been out there. I think other people have used it, and so anyway, that's a confession. But what I mean by that is what I've seen is that narcissists are sort of evolving in the sense that now it used to be when I first got into ministry 20, 25 years ago, they were pretty cold, unemotional, grandiose. But now it's like when I get a call to like consult with a church and I begin talking to him, he's like, well, I'm in weekly therapy and, I've got an accountability group and I know my Enneagram number, so I can't be a narcissist. And all this like psychological and emotional and therapeutic language that makes you think, well, he must be fine. And the reality is it's all kind of a smokescreen. They're not really doing the work. Even the counseling, even the Enneagram stuff is just a way of avoiding the deeper and harder conversations. And when it comes right down to it, that's even more crazy making for people around them. I was talking to a staff member at a church recently whose pastor knows his Enneagram and goes to counseling. He said, it's so crazy making because when I say, but no, he bullies me in this way and that way, people will say, well, he couldn't possibly do that because he's in therapy. And so that's the vulnerability. It's a fake vulnerability that has actually made some narcissists even more deceptive.
Right. I'm very familiar with that.
Okay.
All right. So I really felt like the next part that we're going to go over I think it's part of healing, but the beginning of chapter 5, you quote, "Too often the wounded boy grows up to become a wounding man, inflicting upon those closest to him the very distress he refuses to acknowledge within himself." And that's Terrence Real?
Yes.
From The Inner Life of a Narcissistic Pastor. You continue on in the chapter to talk about our shadow, which is our hidden shame, our secret motivations, our quiet rage, our burdening fears, and our fierce passions being tucked away, but that's how we like it. You introduce Robert Bly's concept of the long invisible bag we drag behind us, that container for all we refuse to accept about ourselves. Now, growth involves opening the invisible bag. And you say you opened your bag 20 years ago with your therapist because they felt safe to you. Somehow he created the psychologist what they say is a holding environment in which your deepest shame, fear, and anger might find their way into the light. It's an experience we take for granted. But safety allows our resistances to relax, our hearts to become tender, and our vulnerability to find a home. Can you just talk a little bit more about what happened when you opened your bag 20 years ago? And can you explain how you feel about narcissists and when they open their bag?
Yeah, it's sort of a strange metaphor, but I heard it a long time ago and I thought, it's kind of helpful that there are things that we don't like about us. We kind of put these things, we don't know we're doing it, but we put them in this bag. And by the time we're 35, 40 years old, the bag is very, very long and we're dragging it behind us. Maybe that's why as we get older, we start to feel a little bit heavier. It doesn't, there's some more aches and pains that come with growing up, I guess. But for me, it took, and I was a little bit younger, and I feel really grateful for this, but it took a wiser, older professor calling me out at 27 years old to say, hey, you're in seminary. If you don't look at your life and you don't do your work, I think you can be dangerous. I think you could be dangerous to the church. And I think, and I think he even said, I think you might even be dangerous to your wife right now, and it was really profoundly disruptive moments of, well, first I was defensive, of course, and then there was a sense of, if I have an opportunity right now to look at my life in the way that he's inviting me to, even if it takes me a little bit longer to graduate from seminary, I might want to do that. And so I enrolled in the counseling program at the seminary. For me, back in that day, men mostly went into the Master of Divinity program and women mostly went into the counseling program. So when I got into the counseling program, there were a group of women who were like, why is this guy here? And we don't like what we've known about him from classes that we've taken together. And it was this incredible, courageous group of women who began to give me feedback. I was 27 then, I'm 51 now, and I still tear up thinking about like how important it was for 2 years to hear regular and steady feedback about how they experienced me, how I showed up, how this interaction was, when we did co-counseling together, how I might take over a session or dominate. And what that was like for them, and I don't test. I don't think I'm on the narcissistic spectrum. I do think that I have some other stuff that I could admit to, but I do think that what that was for me was this wake up call to, if you don't take seriously how you show up, your impact on people, then you will run roughshod over churches, people, and congregations. So one of my policies as a pastor for a long, long time was, tell me how you experienced me. Anyone. I still do this now as a seminary professor.
I found that interesting in your book that you do that.
Yeah.
I thought that was great.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
it's humbling, right? To have one, I had a student, I think I tell the story of a student who came to me and said, I've been trying to get your attention for weeks. You every time you walk through the main hall of the seminary, it seems like you're walking fast and you're in a rush to do something. And you're the guy who talks to us about being present. And so I just want to let you know that you're really hard to track down and you're not very present. And that's hard to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet my next question has to be, well, tell me more about that. Tell me about how that felt, how that hurt you. And so I just think that's part of growing up. That's part of remaining humble. At the same time, it can be humiliating, to get that feedback.
Yeah, I guess we all have that choice of like, okay, what are we going to do with that information? And you were brave enough to not let it bring up this wall of protection, but really to look down and, let it truly humble you.
Yeah.
And I guess, we all have that choice. So you say abusers shame and humiliate. They do violence to their victims. Those who assault bury their shame so deep that their hidden rage turns outward. By seeing what is happening inside, your hope is that we can move from reactive to preventive strategies for healing wounded women and men. Anything you want to expound on that?
Yeah, well, I think when I think about reactive, I often talk about living reactively versus living reflectively. And I think that a lot of us, and maybe I'd even venture to say that most of us, because of how we're made by God, because we've got this adaptive autonomic nervous system, we live sometimes in fight or flight. We live reactively. We live anxiously. I mean, I know because of my own story of some abuse and trauma that a large part of how I've shown up in the world, at least early on, but I still think today in some ways too, I don't expect the welcome. I don't expect the smile. I don't expect generosity. I expect to be hurt. I expect there to be another agenda. I look at the world through cautious eyes to some extent. And that's, when we get in touch with our trauma stories, that's what we have to come to grips with. How are we showing up in the world? How does anxiety play out in our inner worlds and in our relationships? And so the shift from reactive to reflective, it's an emotional shift. It's a physiological shift. It's a shift of presence from a place of anxiety to a place of trust, from a place of clench fists, as Henry Nouwen says, to open hands and surrender. And I think that over time, what I've witnessed in my own body, even in my own being, is there's this gradual opening to believe that God is good, that I'm safe, that the world is going to be okay, that I don't have to show up with clenched fists, that operate from a posture of humility and curiosity and not control. And that takes healing. That takes healing to the autonomic nervous system, to our emotions, in our trauma stories. If you guys do such good work. And, if you're a victim of abuse and trauma, your default, your system says danger, danger, danger.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some healing to be done there.
Definitely.
Yeah, your book was a good reminder of we need to continue, healing each layer at a time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and what I also found interesting was when we were talking before about your shadow and opening up your bag, what you say about a narcissist is that, so you talk about how you have to feel safe, but the shadow dance of a narcissist is a dance of radical avoidance of anything that threatens his grandiosity, control, certainty, and while the narcissist lives self-defensively, he is really threatened by what is hidden within. And then you talk about the scared little boy again. And I just found that interesting that you also say, so on a narcissist, the invisible bag, it stretches miles behind them. I found that quite interesting.
Yeah.
To be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2 of When Narcissism Comes to Church.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.